What is up, Earth's mightiest subscribers? It's Blerd without fear. Welcome back to the channel. All right, so today's video, we're going to be talking about Rise of the Powers of 10, #1, written by Kieran Gillen, with art by R.B. Silva and color by David Curiel. So to set the table for this issue, if you've not been keeping up, we have what is effectively end of the Krakoan era, and it's ending the way that it began, whereas this all kicked off with House of X #1, a story arc that was comprised of two completely, for the most part, different story arcs, but all came together for one complete whole. Whereas you had House of X, which mostly depicted the present day goings-on of mutants in the Marvel Comics universe, and the Powers of 10 series depicting what were, for the most part, future events, and in some scant few cases, the past as well, and even some present sprinkled in there towards the end. And that's kind of what this dual story arc is supposed to basically give off the same effect, with Fall of the House of X depicting the present, whereas Rise of the Powers of 10 is depicting the future. And in this case, even some future timelines that may even no longer exist. When we pick up this book, I will definitely say the X-Men are in a very weird place. A place that's very reminiscent of the suicide mission on the Orcus Forge in House of X #3 and 4. We open this issue up with Emma Frost freshly having sacrificed herself to buy her fellow X-Men time in stopping Orcus. We also see Gambit and Mystique do about roughly the same thing, all in an effort to obtain the location of a particular persona non grata that Orcus doesn't want the X-Men knowing about. And long story short, it's Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister was never killed by Orcus when they finally got their hands on him, following the events in between the Immortal X-Men #18, which is pretty much the last time we saw Sinister, and now. And they did it largely because they knew if they killed him, he very likely would have come back somewhere else and they'd have to find him all over again. But getting back to the Gambit and Mystique part of it, they also sacrifice themselves to try and get this knowledge to the X-Men, with both characters seemingly finally being chummy with one another after years, decades even, of being pretty dismissive and even mean-spirited towards one another. And we even get to see in a moment where Gambit, after, just shortly before Mystique makes her ultimate sacrifice for the good of mutant kind, we see Gambit use his powers in ways that we actually really don't ever see Gambit use, at least with not any level of control. It's long been a deal where Gambit has not been able to affect organic matter. He can charge up inanimate objects, but organic matter's always been tricky for him. And early on in Gambit's publication history, it was always believed that this was just a quirk of his powers. It was just something he couldn't do. But in reality, we would later learn, going back into Gambit's history, that Gambit actually can affect organic matter. It just wasn't something he could effectively control, so Mr. Sinister put in a block that made it to where he couldn't. But we have seen Gambit attempt this before, just that I don't think we've ever seen it this explosive. Unfortunately, he uses himself as the thing that he is charging up. There are a lot of deaths early on in this issue, and even some near kills in this as well, but this is all because this timeline doesn't matter. And since it doesn't matter, I feel weird even talking about it, but there are some interesting tidbits to take away just to show you how desperate the situation is. We have a new Captain Krakoa, who is Kamala Khan, and she is listed as the last Captain Krakoa ever. We also have Kate Pryde having returned, and for those wondering why Kate Pryde looks different, she's acting differently, she kind of looks, I guess, dead, for lack of a better way to put it. The truth is, that is kind of by design. She has consumed the Death Seed, the very same Death Seed that Apocalypse used to turn Warren Worthington III, aka Angel, into his Horseman of Death. We also see that Iron Man is present, albeit it's not actually Iron Man. And I remember looking on Twitter and everyone was always like, oh, who is this? This is the big mystery. Who is this Iron Man? Because it's not Tony Stark. Oh, it's gonna be this huge mystery. It's not a huge mystery. It's Tony Stark, only it's not Tony Stark. For those who ever kept up with the Invincible Iron Man series when Riri Williams took over for Tony Stark after his quotey fingers death in Civil War II, there was an AI of Tony Stark based on his brain scans that was helping mentor Riri Williams as she was coming into her own. This is pretty much the same thing, albeit just trapped inside of an Iron Man armor, and it's listed as the last Iron Man armor he ever created, but it looks more like the stealth armor that we've seen over on the Jerry Duggan side of things. And the reason why this is not actually a mistake is because this isn't the same timeline, and this is pretty much just an alternate deal in everything that's going on. So the Mysterium armor, which was teased, just a couple of weeks ago, it is still happening. It's not being undone or anything like that. This is just wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey shenanigans. We also see that Wolverine, who seems to pretty much be the same Wolverine as we've always known him, he's referred to as the living X Sanction. And not gonna lie to you, I actually had to think about this for a little bit, but there is actually a story arc called Avengers X Sanction that takes place as a precursor before Avengers versus X-Men, or AVX, as it's colloquially known. But that was a story arc I didn't really commit to memory because it's kind of short. It's 4 issues. It's not really the biggest or greatest thing on Earth. It's a good story, but it wasn't anything that was like, oh my God, this is changing the game forever. No, it's just a good, serviceable story arc that gets you ready for AVX. That said, the whole him being the last X Sanction, because of how Cable was acting during that story arc where he was going after the Avengers with extreme prejudice in an effort to save Hope Summers, I just took it as that. This is just Wolverine having extreme impunity to do whatever he wants, which, I mean, honestly, is kind of just Wolverine, period. And then, of course, Synch is now the Professor in this timeline. This is something we kind of knew about early on. In the early solicits, we saw Synch sitting in the old Xavier hover chair. And the reasoning behind this is something I've actually talked about more than a few times over on the Jerry Duggan X-Men side of things. If you have not been keeping up, basically what's going on is this Synch, for those who don't know, has the power to use the mutant abilities of anyone within about roughly 15 to 20 feet of himself. Now, one thing we learned in the Jerry Duggan series of X-Men is that Synch can use this ability to recall mutants who he's synced with in the past. So any mutant who he's ever borrowed powers from, even if he's not near them, he can recall their power from memory, no matter how far away they are. We saw in Jerry Duggan's X-Men where Synch had recalled the Omega level telepathic abilities of Jean Grey, despite the fact that she wasn't on Earth. As a matter of fact, she was on the complete opposite side of the galaxy from Synch, and he was still able to do this, using her power no differently than she would have. But to do this, we learned about 2 Hellfire galas ago that when Synch does this, it ages him dramatically, and he's had to do this a lot as of late, considering the fact that there aren't that many mutants left, and we even see him use the powers of characters like Apocalypse in this issue. And to do this, it's aged him significantly to the point where his body is effectively the age of an octogenarian, despite the fact that he shouldn't be out of his early to mid-20s. But yeah, this whole thing is everyone sacrificing themselves for the greater good to try and get to Sinister, and they're not trying to save Sinister, they're actually trying to kill him, because that's exactly what Wolverine does, and I'm pretty sure this is going to bear fruit at some later point, maybe, but that is honestly kind of nebulous considering what is going on with another group of mutants. But we'll get to that here in a second. But basically, yes, when Wolverine gets to Sinister, he kills him, plain and simple. And it's largely just based, I believe, on what Sinister just said. If they killed him, he had protocols in place to revive himself somehow. And if that is the case, killing him very likely would put him somewhere Orchis would be incapable of finding him. Or, not to say they wouldn't be able to find him, but it would just take him a while. But I feel like that is a story arc we'll probably revisit in a later issue, because right now there's just bigger fish to fry. Because Orchis right now, at least more specifically Omega Sentinel and Nimrod, with the help of Moira X, though Moira X is kind of tangential to this, at least on Orchis' side of things. Nimrod and Omega Sentinel, they are trying to summon the Dominion, and they have already created a world mine, seemingly out of the Orchis Forge. The reason why they created this world mine is because a world mine is one of the most powerful things in existence that can attract the attention of a Dominion, and they want to be absorbed by the Dominion. Now, if you're wondering why this is actually a good thing based on what we know about Dominions, when we have talked about Dominions in the past, what we know about them is that they absorb and pretty much consume everything that they come into contact with. And whatever they absorb and consume, it no longer exists. It ceases to exist as it was before. It becomes part of a greater whole. Now, this probably isn't that big of a deal to characters like Nimrod and Omega Sentinel, because they would become part of a much more powerful entity. And them being artificial intelligence, existence in terms of human understanding doesn't really mean anything to them. So joining with the Dominion is a win-win no matter how you slice it. Yeah, they lose their individuality. However, who needs individuality when you're a part of something as powerful as the Dominion, which can exist outside of time and space and is presumed to be virtually indestructible? Now, for those wondering why Orchis is all tied into this and why Omega Sentinel and Nimrod are seemingly working against Orcus's mandates, because to do this is to destroy humanity as well. And for those who have not been keeping up, this is something that goes all the way back to Jonathan Hickman's Inferno from 2022. In that arc, and I've talked about it before, so if you want to know more about it, go check it out up here. But it's long since been my mindset since Omega Sentinel revealed the timeline she originally comes from, where mutants always win, that when she came back with the help of what was believed to be a trickster titan, something she referred to as such, in this issue it's referred to by Nimrod as a trickster dominion. But regardless of what it was, they all look eerily like the Phalanx. So humanity was never meant to be protected. I've said this for a long time regarding what's going on with Orchis, that eventually their pro-human mandates would get turned against them by the AI in their midst. And it actually makes sense when you think about it, the extremes that were going on between the X-Men and Orchis. The X-Men had a, I would dare say, vehement anti-artificial intelligence policy, to the point that they even had the Smileys, who were artificial intelligence and had decided to align themselves with mutants. They had them deleted, well, almost deleted. They still exist, just in a different format. Whereas Orchis is perfectly fine with working with artificial intelligence, and we see how these things have both come back to bite them, these extremes that they've taken. All that said, what Omega Sentinel and Nimrod are doing is all for naught, because while they think that they have the upper hand, they've already created the human machine monolith from Powers of 10 #1. As a matter of fact, a lot of what we see in this timeline is all from the Powers of 10 side of the House of X story arc. And the only thing that isn't there yet is the church side of it, the human machine ascendancy. Speaking of human followers, they do have one human follower in their midst. Dr. Stasis is the one human we see amongst Orchis, and humans are treated pretty dismissively, kind of about roughly the same way as the hunters and hounds were in Powers of 10. Dr. Stasis is basically in that same exact position. Now, he is considered a part of what is referred to as human/resources. And by human resources, it doesn't mean that they go after employees at the behest of the company with the pretense that they are actually for the employee. But no, they're just humans who happen to be resources at the new Orcus's disposal. It bears mentioning that Fei Long is specifically brought up in regards to Orcus personnel who is no longer among the living, and it's safe to say that characters like Dr. Alia Gregor, as well as Director Devo, and maybe even MODOK for that matter, a lot of those characters, they're probably dead, all because they didn't want to go with what Nimrod and Omega Sentinel were cooking. But Dr. Stasis is no fool, and he has aligned himself with the Children of the Vault in secret. And the Children of the Vault, who don't really factor very heavily into this. I was a little bit saddened by that. I kind of hoped we would have seen a little bit more of them, or at least had them do more than just stand around and pontificate. But Dr. Stasis had at some point thrown in his lot with the Children of the Vault, and he had come up with a countermeasure to stop Orchis from fully being consumed by the Dominion, and setting up Dr. Stasis to not only betray the Children of the Vault, but become Dominion himself. None of it works because, like I said, this is all just an alternate timeline. This is basically all just one and but many different scenarios where an unseen group of mutants have been working in secret to stop each and every attempt of every version of Sinister from achieving Dominion status. Remember when we talked about this in the Fall of the House of X #1, which, by the way, and checked it out, video is right up here. In the video for that issue, I talked about how we don't really know exactly what it is Xavier and Rasputin 4 are up to. It seems like they've been working together in secret and haven't really been telling the other mutants on the X-Men what's been going on. They're working a completely different angle, with Rasputin having left the mission to exfiltrate Cyclops from Orchis custody. Now we know what it is she's doing. She's working with Charles Xavier, as well as Cipher, a character we haven't seen since not too terribly long before the end of the Immortal X-Men series, and really just roughly before the Hellfire Gala. They're in the very same place, most likely, that Krakoa put Cipher in the first place. In Immortal X-Men number 13, Cipher was dragged down into the pits of Krakoa, and we really didn't know what happened to him after that. And it's something I've speculated even that he wasn't in the pit, because if he was, Orchis would have found him when Captain Krakoa had extracted both of the Fenris twins out of the pit in Jerry Duggan's Uncanny Avengers. No, he is somewhere very specifically different. He was in a no place that Krakoa had created. For those who don't remember, no places come from non-naturally occurring flowers of Krakoa, and these places exist outside of the normal collective consciousness of Krakoa. These are places even Krakoa itself could potentially not know about, but this is a no place that is of note because it's one that is specifically created by Krakoa for Krakoa and its allies. And while in that no place, Cipher helped Krakoa become something more, creating more Krakoan technology that allowed them to become a no place that existed outside of time and space, which means that the Dominion cannot spy on them. The Dominion can see any and every instance of human life across the timeline because they exist outside of time and space. But anything else that exists in that same space with it, it can't really observe in the exact same way. And right now, these three mutants, alongside what is presumed to be two more mutants that are listed in one of the final data pages for this issue, mutants who we don't really know who they are, we don't know their names or their abilities, all of that information is redacted, but I'm pretty sure in the next couple of issues, maybe even in the very next issue, we'll learn who these mutants are. But getting back to it, the setup that Xavier is using to try to stop Orchis from bringing the Dominion to Earth and absorbing all of humanity, as well as stopping the Sinisters from achieving Dominion status themselves, which honestly, they'll probably always fail to do anyway, regardless of any intervention on their part, because the Dominion already exists. They're doing this using time travel and resetting reality. Now, how exactly they're doing all this is kind of up in the air. The mentality I have with it is that just based on the stuff we see laying around, all the various eggs that are littering the no place, part of me wonders if they're using something very similar to what Sinister created in Immortal X-Men number 1, the Moira engine. Only maybe these aren't, baby Moiras that haven't been brought into existence yet. Maybe they're just, Moira husk bodies with an X gene activated. It's hard to say, and who knows how they would have the technology to do that in the first place, because the 5 don't seem to be present here, or maybe that is what's going on here. Maybe a couple of the 5 are around, and that's how they're able to do it. It's tough to say at this point, but maybe they're using a version of Tempo or Tempest, and who knows, maybe those are one or more of the 2 mutants we haven't seen yet. I'm even more inclined to think that potentially Manifold could be involved in this, because one thing we gotta remember, a lot of people think of Manifold as a teleporter, but we can't forget that Manifold is a character who, while yes, he does teleport, but it's not what his power is. His power is that he speaks to the universe, and the universe listens to him. If he asked space to present to him a portion of the sun that he could hold in the palm of his hand, it would do so, and we've seen him do this before in the pages of Al Ewing's Sword. Who's to say he couldn't help them with their whole staying outside of space and time situation right now in this series? Now, granted, when last we saw him, he was locked away in a stasis tube and still outfitted with the control chip that the new power broker had implanted on him, and Destiny and Rogue were really the only ones who knew where he was. We don't really have any follow-up on that, but who knows? A lot has happened since the Rogue and Gambit series, and even more so since the Hellfire Gala. It's up in the air at this point, but somehow they are effectively resetting the timeline and going back and trying different ways to shut this whole thing down. And there's also a mission that is brought up at the end of this issue regarding Moira X, because at the end of the day, Xavier and Cipher and Rasputin 4, they all know they can't defeat the Dominion. They can't kill him. He exists outside of space and time. He is virtually indestructible, and every time they do stop Orchis from bringing the Dominion to Earth, or even when they do manage to pull that off, or even when a Sinister manages to attempt Dominion status, the Dominion, otherwise known as Enigma, the original Nathaniel Essex that we talked about in Immortal X-Men number 18. And once again, if you haven't seen that, check out this video up here. The man once known as Nathaniel Essex, who transcended normal mortal human life and has become an artificial intelligence himself, now known as Enigma, he comes along and consumes every reality. And apparently he's been doing this as long as the Krakoan era has been a thing. Every time a timeline has been reset, he comes along, absorbs it, at least the major ones, the major incidents. We know that every time that Stasis has attempted Dominion status, and Orbis Stellaris, the same, even Mother Righteous, and even Sinister himself, each time he comes along and absorbs what's there, increasing his own power. So you can't defeat a being like that. The only way you can stop him is to destroy his method of getting to that point. And even then, I think that might even be a little nebulous itself. But right now, what Xavier believes is that they need to go back to the starting point. And the starting point is Moira McTaggart. In order to shut down this whole scenario, they need to pull a Terminator, something that's actually referenced more than once in this entire issue, and more specifically by Nimrod, when he mentions this is what happens if Terminator had a happy ending. And by happy ending, he means that if Skynet wins, because it's from his perspective. And in a way, it's kind of both Orcus and Xavier and company. They're both trying to effect a happy ending Terminator style. Whereas in the case of Orcus, their happy ending is Skynet winning. Skynet going back and assassinating John Connor before he's even born. And then on the terms of Xavier and company, it's kind of something similar. Only in their case, they need to go back and assassinate Moira McTaggart before her X gene ever activates. Now, this is destructive in all ways, not just to Orcus or the Dominion, but also to the Krakoan Age, and is very likely how all this From the Ashes stuff is going to be set up and how the X-Men are going to be rebooted. And we all know Gail Simone is going to very likely wind up writing the new X-Men story arc that's going to be coming out, and she's been playing kind of coy about it, but I mean, we've seen the solicits, we've seen the Free Comic Book Day stuff. Usually the person who's writing the story in the Free Comic Book Day issue is usually writing the actual main title, but that's neither here nor there. If Gail Simone is real deal on it, I'm for it. I love Gail Simone's writing, so I'm in for a penny and for a pound on that one. But all that aside, this is how you get the big bad reset and, you know, go back to the status quo that everyone's so afraid of. In this case, I'm actually perfectly for it. I mean, the X-Men had their day in the sun. Even if they don't go back to the mansion, the Krakoan era is over and it's run its course. Now, going back to unaliving Moira McTaggart before her X gene activates, they have to do this because the Enigma thrives on Moira's lives being reset, and anytime that Xavier and company reset the timeline whenever Orcus or one of the Sinister variants does something regarding the Dominion. So to go back and destroy Moira before her X gene activates at age 13, this would effectively stop the Dominion from being able to do anything. This would get rid of not only Moira McTaggart, but it would also mean the Moira engine never exists. And the Moira engine is one of the key ways that the Dominion has been thriving. It also means that Orcus very likely doesn't come into existence, or at the very least, doesn't come into existence as the powerhouse that it is. The Krakoan Age never happens, and once again, we're back at the mansion. The trick of the matter is that Moira, who, once again, she's for the most part kind of been an outside player, kind of a background player if you really want to get technical with it, and they have to get rid of her. They have to undo everything. And honestly, I kind of feel like Moira has been the bane of mutant kind's existence off and on. She has been an off and on ally and enemy of mutant kind, and right now she's an enemy. She pretended to be an ally. She worked with mutants for as long as she could. She initially started out trying to get rid of the X gene, albeit she wasn't trying to do it to eradicate mutants, but at the end of the day, she believed that was the only way to free her from this endless cycle of life and death. And once she met Mystique and Destiny, she threw in her lot with mutants because, honestly, she got shamed and scared into it. And once she realized she couldn't win with mutants, she threw in her lot with Orcus. Because at the end of the day, Moira just wants to survive. Becoming part of the Dominion is as close as she's ever gonna get to getting any of that. She's become an artificial intelligence that can't really be truly fully destroyed, not without a lot of effort. And if she becomes a part of the supreme AI intelligence, the Dominion, she would cease to exist as humanity would know it, same as I mentioned earlier. But in this case, she would get to rest. And that's what she really wants. I feel like somewhere in this, Moira might get a redemptive moment or a moment to kind of explain herself. The real rub here is that Rasputin 4 is gonna have to go back in time and take Moira McTaggart out. Questions now going to be, how is Orcus going to fight back against this, and what threats are going to be out there when Rasputin 4 goes back that are going to try and stop her from unaliving a preteen Moira McTaggart? Because I can tell you right now, Moira McTaggart is very likely going to try and go back and stop her herself, or we might even see the future version of Moira, who is already thrown in her lot with the Phalanx, come back just the same as we saw in 10 Deaths of Wolverine. You guessed it, obligatory channel outro time. If you're not subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. Clicking that subscribe button and tapping that notification bell ensures that you get more videos just like this one, and you don't miss any of my other content that I drop throughout the week, plus my live streams every Thursday and Saturday. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure you click that like button, keep it plus ultra, and sound off in the comments.